My name is Luna. I'm in my late 30s. For most of my adult life, I've been known as the calm one, the woman who keeps things running, who listens more than she speaks, who remembers birthdays and deadlines and how everyone takes their coffee. I've been a partner, a professional, a caretaker of details, the kind of person people describe as steady, sometimes and almost always fine. Most always. That's how I was seen. Fine. I've learned that fine is a convenient word. It lets people stop looking closer. If you passed me on the street or sat across from me at a dinner table, you might assume I was agreeable, maybe a little quiet. Certainly not someone with sharp edges. I don't correct people when they underestimate me. I never really have. Not because I don't notice it, but because I understand how revealing silence can be. I'm telling you this story now, not to entertain you with drama and not to burn anyone down in revenge. This isn't that kind of story. What I'm sharing is a record, a sequence, a slow, deliberate shift from being perceived to being precise. This is the story of how my marriage ended. Not with shouting or betrayal in the way people usually imagine, but with paperwork, with language, with a narrative written about me, without me. At one point, that narrative had a title that still feels surreal to say out loud. My husband tried to have me declared legally incompetent. And in black and white court filings, there was a sentence that changed how I understood power forever. The court papers cited emotional instability, written by his lawyer. I won't sensationalize what happened. There were no sudden revelations, no cinematic confrontations. What unfolded instead was quieter and far more unsettling. A gradual realization that someone who shared my home was also studying my silences, mislabeling my restraint, and mistaking my composure for weakness. This story is about that miscalculation. Over the next chapters, I'll walk you through who I was in that relationship, how small dismissals became normalized, and how roles are assigned long before anyone agrees to them. I'll talk about the moment something shifted inside me, not outwardly, not dramatically, but in a way that made everything after irreversible. You'll hear about preparation that looked like patience, about silence that wasn't surrender, about choices made without announcing themselves, and about the strange clarity that arrives when someone underestimates you for the last time. I'm not here to ask for sympathy. I'm not here to present myself as flawless. I made compromises. I stayed quiet when speaking up would have been easier. I trusted longer than I should have. This is not a victory story. It's an honesty story. If you're listening, because you've ever felt reduced to a version of yourself you didn't recognize, if you've ever been spoken about instead of spoken to, then you'll understand why this matters. Before we go any further, let me ask you something gently. Have you ever realized, too late, that someone had been defining you while you were busy holding everything together? I was dependable. That was the word most often used to describe me, said with a kind of casual certainty, as if it explained everything anyone needed to know. Dependable meant I remembered. Dependable meant I adapted. Dependable meant I absorbed friction so others didn't have to feel it. In my marriage, I was the stabilizer, the one who smoothed transitions, filled gaps, anticipated problems before they became visible. I didn't announce these things. I just did them. Over time, that quiet consistency became my defining feature. Not my intelligence, not my judgment, not my autonomy, just my usefulness. To my husband, I was the calm one, the emotionally grounded counterweight to his ambition, his intensity, his certainty. When people said this out loud, it was framed as a compliment. I was proud of it at first. I believed calm was strength. I still do. But there's a difference between being calm and being cast as emotionally inert. In social settings, I was often introduced last, not out of malice, just habit. My career was described vaguely, even though I managed complex systems and budgets that required precision and foresight. People would ask him follow-up questions about his work. With me, they nodded and moved on. I noticed these patterns early. I just didn't assign them meaning yet. At home, decisions developed a rhythm. He would propose. I would consider. If I hesitated, it was labeled uncertainty. If I asked questions, it was framed as anxiety. Over time, my pauses were interpreted not as thoughtfulness, but as emotional noise that needed managing. I learned that the fastest way to keep peace was to compress myself, to deliver conclusions without showing the process. to agree quickly or stay silent. And because nothing visibly broke when I did this, everyone, including me, assumed it was working. What no one seemed to notice was how often I was spoken around. Conversations about our future happened in my presence, but not with my participation. Plans were described to me, not shaped with quiet collaboration. I was included as an implementer, not a decider. And still, I didn't protest. Not because I didn't care, but because I believed there was dignity in restraint. I believed that being steady would eventually earn trust, that my consistency would speak for itself. In hindsight, that belief was my blind spot. I was never chaotic, never reckless, never unstable. But because I processed internally and expressed selectively, my emotional landscape was invisible to those who expected loud signals. And invisibility is dangerous when other people are willing to narrate on your behalf. I became a fixed character in their minds, supportive, sensitive, maybe a little overwhelmed, someone to protect, someone to manage, someone whose concerns could be reframed as feelings rather than information. The truth is, I was always paying attention. I noticed how often my words were paraphrased incorrectly, how my caution was rebranded as fear, how my silence was used as confirmation of assumptions I never agreed to. None of it felt urgent enough to confront, yet. Each moment on its own seemed too small to correct. So I let the role settle around me. Reliable, useful, invisible. And once a role is established, people stop asking whether it's accurate. They start defending it, protecting it, even weaponizing it if it serves them. At the time, I thought I was choosing harmony. I didn't realize I was being rehearsed for something else entirely. I can still remember the first moment that didn't feel right. Not dramatic, not explosive, just slightly off, like a door closing more softly than it should have. At the time, I didn't name it. I folded it away with other small discomforts, the kind adults are taught to minimize in the interest of maturity. It happened during a routine appointment, a meeting we both attended, seated side by side, the kind of administrative thing couples do together without thinking twice. I asked a question, measured, specific, relevant. Before the other person could answer, my husband laughed lightly and said, "She gets anxious about these things." It was said kindly, casually, almost affectionately. The room accepted it immediately. No one looked at me to confirm or deny it. No one asked what I meant by my question. The conversation simply adjusted as if a small correction had been made. I felt a brief urge to clarify, to say that anxiety wasn't the source of my concern, that I was thinking 3 steps ahead, not spiraling. But the moment passed. Correcting it would have felt awkward, disruptive, so I stayed quiet. That was the first cut. Small enough to dismiss, clean enough to heal without leaving an obvious scar. On the drive home, I mentioned it gently. I said I didn't love being described that way. He seemed genuinely surprised, told me I was overthinking it, said everyone knew he didn't mean anything by it. He reminded me, softly, that I was sensitive sometimes, and that wasn't a bad thing. That word again, sensitive. I let it go. After that, similar moments began appearing more frequently. A story retold with a detail altered, a decision explained on my behalf, a joke about how I worried too much or needed reassurance. Each instance was minor, each one plausible, and importantly, each one socially acceptable. No one challenged it because nothing sounded overtly cruel. Friends smiled indulgently. Professionals nodded sympathetically. I noticed how quickly people accepted his framing of me. It wasn't malicious, it was efficient. He spoke with confidence. I spoke with precision. Confidence travels faster. I started noticing how my objections were received when I did voice them. They were met with concern, not consideration, with reassurance, not engagement. "It'll be okay," people would say, as if I were afraid of something I couldn't name. What unsettled me wasn't just that my words were being softened, it was that my intent was being rewritten. I wasn't worried. I was assessing. I wasn't emotional. I was deliberate. But once that alternative version of me entered the room, it stayed. It hovered. It explained things away. And the strangest part was how invisible the shift was to everyone else. If I tried to point it out, I sounded defensive. If I stayed silent, I confirmed it. So again, I chose quiet. Not because I agreed, but because I was still operating under an old assumption. That patterns reveal themselves clearly, that fairness eventually corrects misinterpretation, that being consistent is enough. I told myself it was nothing. Just one of those marital quirks. Just language. Just a misunderstanding. I didn't yet understand how language, once repeated by the right voice, becomes evidence. Once something happens twice, your mind starts working to make it make sense. Once it happens 3 times, you begin building explanations that allow you to live with it. That's what I did. The pattern didn't escalate suddenly. It settled in. It became familiar enough that I stopped noticing each individual instance and started recognizing the shape of them instead. Conversations where my input was summarized instead of heard, decisions that arrived fully formed, already justified, moments when I realized I was being managed, not partnered with. And every time I felt the faint internal resistance, I explained it away. I told myself he was under stress, that his job required decisiveness, and that I balanced that by being thoughtful. I reframed my discomfort as empathy. I reminded myself that relationships involve compromise and that not every irritation deserves a confrontation. I was very good at rationalizing silence. There were dinners where I'd begin a sentence and watch it trail off, not because anyone interrupted me, but because I could already predict the response. A reassuring smile, a hand on my arm. "You're overthinking again." It was never said sharply. That's what made it effective. Gradually, I learned to pre-edit myself, to remove anything that might be perceived as emotional, to flatten my delivery until it was impossible to mischaracterize. Ironically, that restraint made me appear even more muted, even more in need of guidance. People around us began to mirror his language. Friends would check in with him about whether I was doing okay. Family members would ask if I was handling things all right. No one asked me what I thought. They assumed they already knew. I told myself it was love expressed clumsily, that being protected, even when unrequested, was still care. But something in me was paying attention. I noticed how my confidence in small decisions started to erode, not because I doubted myself, but because I was tired of defending my reasoning. I noticed how often I deferred simply to avoid the gentle resistance that followed any divergence. I noticed how peace was being maintained, but only if I remained predictable. What I didn't notice at first was how these dynamics were becoming recordable. Emails where he summarized conversations in ways that emphasized my uncertainty. Messages to third parties positioning himself as the steady interpreter of my needs. Nothing false, just incomplete, just angled. And I let it happen, because there was no single moment I could point to and say this is where it crossed a line. It was cumulative. 1,000 micro-adjustments that slowly relocated me from equal partner to someone whose reactions needed context. By the time I recognized the normalization for what it was, it already had witnesses. The most dangerous part of being misunderstood isn't the misunderstanding itself. It's when it becomes socially reinforced, when your objections sound like exceptions to an agreed-upon truth. I still believed, deep down, that clarity would return if I just stayed consistent. That fairness had a gravity of its own. That being reasonable would protect me. I didn't yet understand that reasonableness without assertion can be rewritten as fragility. And I didn't yet understand how much documentation was already being created about me, without me. There's a moment when you realize you're no longer responding. You're performing. Not consciously, not theatrically, but with a quiet awareness that certain versions of you are more acceptable than others. For me, that realization came not during an argument, but during a compliment. We were with friends. Someone praised how strong our relationship was. My husband smiled and said, "That's because she's so flexible. She keeps everything grounded." Flexible. Grounded. The words landed softly, but they carried weight. They defined a role I hadn't auditioned for. In that moment, I saw it clearly. I wasn't expected to lead, to challenge, or to complicate. I was expected to absorb, to stabilize, to be the emotional infrastructure that allowed everything else to function smoothly. Reliable, useful, invisible. Once I noticed the role, I saw it everywhere. In how responsibilities defaulted to me without discussion. In how emotional labor was framed as my natural domain. In how my calm was no longer appreciated as discipline, but assumed as capacity. If I expressed fatigue, it was met with concern, but not change. If I expressed disagreement, it was reframed as stress. The system corrected itself quickly, always nudging me back into position. What startled me wasn't that this role existed. It was how many people agreed on it without ever asking me. I realized then that roles aren't assigned in one conversation. They're co-authored through repetition, convenience, and silence. And I had contributed to mine by being competent without being visible. The world rewards clarity. I had offered subtlety. I began to understand that my husband didn't see himself as diminishing me. In his mind, he was translating me, simplifying me for a world that he believed might overwhelm me otherwise. That belief gave him moral permission. And that's when something inside me cooled. Not anger, not sadness, but clarity. Because I saw the logic and I saw the danger. Once someone positions themselves as your interpreter, your voice becomes optional. Once your internal process is labeled emotional instability, your external objections lose credibility. It doesn't require cruelty. It only requires consistency. I stopped trying to correct the role, not because I accepted it, but because I understood that disrupting it directly would only reinforce it. Any protest could be used as proof, any emotion as confirmation. So I stayed composed, more composed than ever. I fulfilled the role flawlessly. I was calm. I was agreeable. I was present. I made no sudden moves. I gave no dramatic signals. I did exactly what was expected of someone who, allegedly, needed stability. And while everyone relaxed into their assumptions, I began paying attention to the structures behind them. Roles create blind spots, and blind spots create opportunity. This wasn't the moment of action. It was the moment of orientation. The moment I stopped asking how to be seen differently and started asking how things actually worked. I didn't need to change who I was. I needed to understand the system that thought it already knew me. The shift didn't announce itself. There was no argument, no discovery, no sudden confrontation that split my life into a clear before and after. If anything, the day looked ordinary from the outside. The kind of day you forget unless something inside you changes shape. I was alone in the house that afternoon. Not unusually so. The light was low, filtered through clouds that made everything feel muted and still. I remember standing in the kitchen, holding a mug I had already forgotten to drink from, rereading a message on my phone. It wasn't cruel. It wasn't threatening. That's what made it unsettling. It was a summary, sent by my husband to a third party, of a conversation we had had the night before. A conversation I remembered clearly. In his version, my concerns had been described as emotional reactions, and my questions as signs she might be overwhelmed right now. There it was again, that translation. What changed that day wasn't the content of the message, it was my response to it. For the first time, I didn't feel the urge to explain myself. I didn't feel defensive. I didn't even feel hurt in the way I had before. I felt still. I read it slowly. Then I read it again, not as his wife, but as an observer. As someone trained to notice systems, not stories. I noticed the pattern of language, the careful neutrality, the plausible concern, the way it positioned him as reasonable and me as fragile, without saying either outright. And I understood something I hadn't allowed myself to understand before. This wasn't misunderstanding, it was strategy. Not necessarily conscious in every moment, not cruel in intention, but strategic in effect. A narrative that benefited him by narrowing the range of how I could be perceived. A narrative that protected him from challenge while appearing compassionate. And suddenly, the past months reorganized themselves in my mind. The casual jokes, the reframing. The concern that redirected attention saw a line I hadn't seen before, because I hadn't wanted to. I had been giving him the benefit of the doubt long after the doubt had earned its place. I sat down at the table and let the feeling settle. No rush, no panic, just recognition. This was the day I stopped assuming fairness was automatic. I realized then that nothing I said emotionally would correct this. No heartfelt explanation, no careful clarification. The issue wasn't my communication, it was the frame around it. And frames don't change because you ask nicely. They change when evidence accumulates elsewhere. That was the moment I chose not to confront him. Not yet. Confrontation would satisfy the part of me that wanted immediate relief, but it would cost me leverage. It would escalate a narrative I didn't control. So instead, I did something far less visible. I paid attention. I began to listen not for tone, but for structure. Not for intent, but for outcome. I watched how decisions were justified, how authority was implied, how concern was used to close conversations instead of open them. And quietly, internally, something aligned. I wasn't angry, I wasn't scared. I was alert. That was the shift. From the outside, nothing changed. That was the point. I still listened. I still nodded. I still responded with the same measured calm that everyone had come to expect from me. If anything, I became easier to be around. Less resistant, less questioning. The absence of friction was almost soothing to the people around me. What they didn't see was that my silence had changed function. Before, it had been reflexive, a way to preserve peace, to avoid being misread, to keep the emotional temperature low. Now it was intentional. Each pause was deliberate. Each withheld clarification was a data point. Silence, I learned, creates a vacuum, and vacuums invite assumption. My husband filled those spaces confidently. He explained my moods. He contextualized my reactions. He reassured people that things were under control. And the more he did, the more comfortable he became doing it. Because nothing pushed back. That comfort was revealing. I noticed how often he spoke for me when I was present. How frequently he used collective language. We decided, we felt, we agreed, even when no such agreement had taken place. I noticed how easily others deferred to his version of events, especially when I didn't immediately correct them. So I stopped correcting, not out of resignation, but out of recognition. Every assumption he made was a line he'd have to stand behind later. Every summary was a record of his perspective, not the truth. And records once created, can be compared. I began to understand that silence unnerves people only when they expect noise. When silence aligns with expectation, it becomes invisible. That invisibility gave me room. I started documenting, not obsessively, not emotionally, just accurately. Dates, phrasing, context. I didn't assign meaning yet. I let patterns speak for themselves. There were moments when I could feel him relaxing into his certainty. Moments when he mistook my lack of resistance for agreement, for dependence, for weakness. I could see it in the way he made plans without consulting me, confident I would adapt. In the way he reassured others about my state of mind, confident I wouldn't contradict him. And I let him believe it, because challenging that belief too early would have collapsed the very conditions that revealed so much. Silence, when chosen, isn't passive. It's a mirror. It reflects people back to themselves. What surprised me most was how calm I felt. This wasn't a waiting game fueled by resentment. It was observational, almost clinical. I wasn't gathering ammunition. I was gathering clarity. I no longer needed to be understood in the moment. I needed the truth to become undeniable later. So I stayed quiet, not shrinking, not disappearing. Positioning. What people often misunderstand about preparation is that it doesn't look like preparation at all. It looks like routine, like patience, like someone who has accepted their place and stopped pushing back. That's why no one noticed when I started learning. I didn't announce it. I didn't ask questions out loud. I didn't signal concern. I simply began paying closer attention to the mechanisms that governed my life. The legal ones, the financial ones, the procedural ones that most people assume will always work in their favor. I had always been organized. That made the shift invisible. A folder here, a notebook entry there, nothing out of character. I wasn't collecting secrets, I was collecting context. I read documents more carefully. Emails, agreements, policies. I noticed how often my name appeared in relation to responsibility, but not authority. How often I was listed as a contact, a support, a backup, but rarely as a decision maker. I noticed, too, how often concern was used as a substitute for consent. I began documenting conversations, not verbatim transcripts, but accurate summaries. What was said, who was present, how it was framed, especially how my internal states were described by others. Words like overwhelmed, emotional, uncertain appeared more often than I had realized. I didn't correct them. Instead, I contrasted them with reality, with outcomes, with my actual behavior, with timelines that showed consistency, not volatility. What no one noticed was how methodical I was becoming. I brushed up on topics I had previously trusted others to handle. Financial structures, shared assets, legal definitions that sounded benign until you read the fine print. I learned how language, when repeated by the right person in the right setting, could quietly become fact. I also learned how easily that process could be reversed. With patience, the most important thing I did was nothing visible at all. I stopped assuming goodwill was enough. I stopped assuming intent mattered more than impact. I stopped assuming that truth on its own would protect me. And still I remained exactly who they expected me to be. I showed up. I fulfilled responsibilities. I didn't escalate. I didn't accuse. I didn't warn. I let everyone stay comfortable in their assumptions. Comfort breeds carelessness. There were moments when I could have intervened, when a single sentence would have corrected a misrepresentation. But I understood now that premature correction would only reset the cycle. It would provoke reassurance, not accountability. So I waited. I watched how narratives solidify when unchallenged, how people begin to rely on them, how they repeat them with confidence, unaware they're building something brittle. What they never noticed was that I was no longer defending myself. I was preparing to be precise. The reveal didn't come with adrenaline. There was no rush, no satisfaction, no sense of triumph. It arrived quietly, the way clarity often does, through comparison. I was reviewing documents one evening, spread across the table in a way that would have looked mundane to anyone else. Bills, correspondence, notes I had taken over time. Nothing dramatic, just information laid out without interpretation. And that's when I saw it. The contradiction wasn't obvious at first. It sat between two narratives that had been running in parallel for months. On one side, repeated characterizations of me as emotionally unstable, overwhelmed, in need of support and guidance. On the other, records that showed consistency, follow-through, reliability, and independent decision-making in every area that actually mattered. The gap between those two stories was undeniable. What struck me wasn't just that the narrative about me was inaccurate, it was that it was selectively applied. My judgment was questioned only when it conflicted with his preferences. My stability was doubted only when I didn't immediately agree. In every context where my competence benefited him, it was assumed without hesitation. That asymmetry was the reveal. I realized then that the story being told about me wasn't about my well-being. It was about control, about establishing a default authority that didn't need to be negotiated, about positioning concern as justification. And suddenly, the legal implications came into focus. Language like emotional instability isn't just descriptive. It's functional. It opens doors. It shifts burden. It reframes disagreement as incapacity. And once that language appears in formal settings, emails, reports, consultations, it gains weight. What I had, without intending to, was leverage. Not because I had caught him in something scandalous, but because I had something more powerful: consistency. A documented contrast between how I was described and how I actually operated. A record that showed pattern, not incident. Narrative, not truth. I didn't feel vindicated, alienated. I felt sober, because leverage, once recognized, brings responsibility. It asks a question you can't unsee. What are you willing to do with this? I sat with that question for a long time. I didn't rush to conclusions. I didn't celebrate my awareness. I understood that this knowledge changed the terrain, but it didn't dictate the path. What it gave me was choice. For the first time in months, I wasn't reacting to a frame someone else had built. I was looking at the structure itself, how it functioned, where it was weak, where it relied on assumptions instead of evidence. And I understood something else, just as clearly. If I moved next, I couldn't move emotionally. I would have to move cleanly, deliberately, in ways that didn't announce themselves until they were complete. That night, I put the documents away. I didn't sleep much. Not from anxiety, but from adjustment. From recalibrating my understanding of what was at stake. The reveal wasn't that he had underestimated me. It was that he believed the system would always take his word over mine. And that belief, once tested, would either hold or collapse entirely. Once you see the structure clearly, indecision becomes impossible. Not because the choice is easy, but because pretending you don't see it anymore is a form of self-betrayal. I didn't decide anything that day, not in the dramatic sense people imagine. There was no vow, no line drawn in the sand. What happened instead was quieter and far more binding. I stopped asking myself how to fix the relationship. I started asking what outcome I could live with. There were options. I laid them out carefully, the way I do with everything that matters. I could confront him directly, name the pattern, demand correction, insist on counseling or mediation. That path promised emotional release. It also promised escalation. Once the narrative of my instability was activated defensively, it would harden. I could leave quietly, remove myself from the environment, rebuild elsewhere. That path offered safety, but at a cost. It would leave the story about me intact, unchallenged. It would confirm the idea that I was fragile, avoidant, unable to cope. Or I could do something far less visible and far more irreversible. I could let the narrative continue just long enough to be tested against reality. That option required restraint. It required precision. It required me to tolerate being underestimated without correcting it. It also required something else: faith in process over emotion. I thought about the future version of myself. Not the relieved one, not the vindicated one, but the one who would have to live with the consequences of whatever I chose. I asked what she would respect. The answer was clear. I wouldn't explode. I wouldn't disappear. I wouldn't beg to be understood. I would let the truth speak in the only language that couldn't be reframed. Documentation, procedure, consistency. This wasn't revenge, it was alignment. Once I made that internal decision, everything else simplified. My role was no longer to defend my character, it was to protect my agency, to ensure that when the system eventually looked at me, it saw evidence, not interpretation. I stopped trying to be fair in the emotional sense. I became fair in the structural sense. That choice closed other doors. There would be no dramatic reconciliation, no moment where he suddenly understood and apologized. I accepted that. Understanding wasn't the goal anymore. Accuracy was. The decision point wasn't about whether I loved him or whether he meant harm. It was about whether I was willing to let someone else define my capacity in a system that had real consequences. I wasn't. And once that decision was made, there was no going back to the version of me who hoped consistency alone would protect her. I had chosen the irreversible path. Not loudly, not publicly, but completely. Once the decision was made, my life split into two parallel tracks. On the surface, nothing changed. I woke up at the same time. I answered messages with the same tone. I attended the same social obligations, nodded at the same comments, accepted the same summaries spoken on my behalf. I remained, to every observer, exactly who they believed me to be: composed, accommodating, slightly opaque. Underneath, everything changed. Movement in silence isn't about secrecy, it's about sequencing, about understanding that the order in which things happen determines how they're interpreted later. I didn't rush, I didn't stack actions on top of each other. I treated my life the way I treat complex systems, one adjustment at a time, each one structurally sound on its own. The first thing I did was separate emotion from logistics. I stopped asking myself how things felt and started asking how things functioned. What mechanisms existed? Who controlled them? What assumptions did they rely on? What documentation did they privilege? I reviewed shared finances carefully, not with suspicion, but with clarity. I noted where authority was implied versus where it was explicit. I made copies of records that reflected my contributions, my consistency, my independent decisions. Not to accuse, not to confront, simply to ensure accuracy existed somewhere outside of memory. I didn't hide this. I also didn't announce it. People assume that if you're not defensive, you're not preparing. That assumption is powerful. I began scheduling things differently. Appointments, consultations, conversations framed as informational rather than reactive. I asked neutral questions and listened carefully to the answers. I paid attention to how professionals spoke when emotion wasn't centered, how differently language behaved when it had to stand on its own. I learned how easily narratives collapse when they're asked to produce specifics. At home, I became even more predictable. Predictability disarms suspicion. I fulfilled responsibilities without complaint. I offered no ultimatums. I didn't withdraw affection or escalate tension. If anything, I appeared more stable than ever. That stability was a buffer. It protected the work happening quietly beneath it. What surprised me was how little resistance there was, how unguarded he became. He assumed the dynamic was settled, that I had accepted my place within it. He spoke more freely, explained more casually, repeated his version of events with increasing confidence. Every repetition was another thread. I documented selectively. Not everything, just what mattered. Not interpretations, facts, dates, phrases, outcomes. I was careful not to editorialize even in my own notes. Editorializing invites doubt. Precision doesn't. At the same time, I began to reposition myself structurally. I clarified boundaries that had previously been blurred. I made small, practical adjustments that were hard to argue with because they were reasonable on their face. Each one stood alone. Together, they formed a pattern. The key was that none of these actions contradicted the narrative being told about me. Someone emotionally unstable, after all, is allowed to be careful. Someone overwhelmed is expected to seek clarity. Someone sensitive is permitted to put safeguards in place. I let those assumptions work for me. There were moments when I felt the old reflex rise, the urge to explain, to justify, to make myself understood in real time. I let that urge pass. Understanding, I had learned, is not the same as recognition. And recognition only comes when systems are forced to reconcile contradiction. Silence gave me time. Time gave me structure. I also made a conscious decision not to poison my own clarity. I didn't vent excessively. I didn't recruit allies. I didn't seek validation. Those things create emotional noise, and noise distorts memory. I needed my recollection clean. The loneliness of that restraint was real. There were nights when I felt the weight of carrying the full picture alone. But that solitude also sharpened my thinking. There was no one else's fear or anger to manage, just facts. I began to understand why people underestimate quiet preparation. It doesn't feel like power while you're doing it. It feels like patience. It feels like waiting. But it isn't waiting. It's positioning. Slowly, imperceptibly, the balance shifted. I wasn't taking anything away. I wasn't forcing change. I was simply ensuring that when the moment came, whatever that moment turned out to be, the record would speak clearly without me having to raise my voice. What made this phase so effective was that it required no performance. I didn't need to appear strong. I didn't need to appear wronged. I didn't need to prove anything yet. I just needed to remain consistent while the narrative about me grew increasingly specific and increasingly brittle. Because narratives that rely on implication eventually run into process. And process does not respond to tone, it responds to evidence. By the time anyone noticed something was different, it wasn't because I had changed. It was because the ground underneath the assumptions had shifted, quietly, completely. Consequences don't always arrive with impact. Sometimes they arrive as absence. That's how it began. Small things stopped happening the way they used to. Not dramatically, not enough for anyone to panic. Just enough to create a faint sense of disorientation, like reaching for a light switch in the dark and finding it slightly farther to the left than you remember. My husband was the first to feel it, though he didn't recognize it as such. He noticed that confirmations he expected didn't come automatically anymore, that timelines required clarification, that people began asking follow-up questions he wasn't used to answering. At first, he interpreted this as friction from the outside world, bureaucracy, inconvenience, other people being inefficient. He vented mildly. I listened calmly. I said very little. What he didn't see was that systems were starting to do what systems always do when narratives and records diverge. They slowed down. They asked for verification. They required documentation instead of reassurance. He had always moved easily through spaces where confidence was enough, where tone carried weight, where interpretation could stand in for proof. Now, gradually, that ease was thinning. I watched this happen without commentary. Others felt it too, though they couldn't name it. Friends seemed less certain about what they knew about me. Professionals addressed questions to both of us instead of defaulting to him. Emails came with me included explicitly, not as an afterthought, but as a primary contact. None of this looked like a loss, but it was, because power, when unexamined, feels like air. You don't notice it until something restricts the flow. I noticed a subtle change in how he spoke about me when I wasn't immediately agreeing. The language became more careful, less expansive. He still framed concern, but now it had to coexist with visible consistency on my part. The old shorthand didn't land the way it used to, and that unsettled him. There were moments when he seemed almost confused. Not angry, not accusatory, just slightly off balance, as if he were recalculating something internally and not liking the numbers. He asked me casually if everything was okay. I said yes, and it was true, because what was happening wasn't emotional, it was procedural. Consequences in systems don't feel like punishment. They feel like friction where there used to be glide. They feel like having to explain yourself when you're used to being believed. They feel like neutral faces asking neutral questions and waiting for complete answers. I noticed how often he tried to reassert the old narrative, and how often it stalled. Not rejected, just slowed. Concern no longer closed conversations. It opened them. That was new. At the same time, I felt something shift inside myself as well. A strange lightness. Not relief exactly, but steadiness. I wasn't holding my breath anymore. I wasn't anticipating the next mischaracterization or rehearsing explanations in my head. The burden of vigilance was lifting. People often assume that consequences look like exposure, like someone being confronted or embarrassed or called out. That wasn't what I wanted, and it wasn't what happened. What happened was subtler and far more effective. The story about me began to lose utility. It didn't disappear, it just stopped working. Where it once smoothed things over, it now raised questions. Where it once clarified, it now complicated. And because it had been repeated so often, its cracks were visible to more than just me. He started double-checking things, asking if I remembered conversations he had previously summarized without hesitation. His confidence became performative instead of assumed. That's when I knew the shift was real, because people don't question narratives that serve them, unless those narratives start costing them something. There was no confrontation, no accusation, just a growing mismatch between expectation and outcome, between the role he thought he was playing and the one he was now being asked to substantiate. And the system, quiet, impartial, indifferent, kept moving. I remained calm throughout, not as a tactic, but because there was nothing left to defend. The work had already been done. The alignment was already in motion. There's a particular moment when someone realizes they no longer control the story, not because someone else has taken it from them, but because it has escaped into process. You can see it in the pause before they speak, in the way they hedge, in the questions they ask not to understand, but to regain footing. I saw that moment approach him slowly, and I did nothing to accelerate it, because consequences, once begun, don't need encouragement. They unfold at their own pace, guided by the very structures people once relied on without question. What mattered most to me was not that he felt the loss, but that I felt the restoration of authorship, of credibility, of self-trust. I wasn't waiting for justice to be delivered emotionally. I was watching accuracy take hold. And accuracy, once established, is very difficult to reverse. By the time he realized something was wrong, he still didn't understand what it was. That confusion was the most telling part. From his perspective, nothing obvious had changed. There had been no argument, no ultimatum, no dramatic withdrawal. I hadn't threatened to leave or demanded anything new. On the surface, I was still calm, still present, still cooperative in all the ways that mattered to daily life. And yet, things no longer moved the way they used to. Requests that once sailed through now came back with questions. Processes that had been informal were suddenly formalized. People who had once deferred now paused, asked, verified. At first, he tried to compensate with charm, with reassurance, with the familiar language of concern that had always worked before. He checked in on me more often, asked if I was feeling stressed, offered to take things off my plate. I accepted politely. What he didn't realize was that these gestures, which once shaped the narrative, were now simply gestures. They no longer explained anything away. They no longer closed loops. Then came the irritation. He grew frustrated with delays that made no sense to him. He complained about inefficiency, about how complicated things had become all of a sudden. He spoke as though the world had changed arbitrarily, without cause. I listened. What he still didn't see was that the world hadn't changed. The record had, and records don't argue back. They don't reassure. They don't soften. They just sit there. There was a moment, small but unmistakable, when panic flickered through him. It happened during a conversation he assumed would go his way, one he entered confidently and exited unsettled. He didn't say much afterward, just paced, replayed details out loud, asked me questions he already knew the answers to. That's when I understood. He could feel the loss of control, but not the mechanism behind it. He started trying to fix things retroactively. He clarified past statements, reframed earlier conversations, attempted to smooth over inconsistencies with explanations that arrived too late. Once a narrative has been externalized, put into process, into documentation, into multiple hands, it stops belonging to any one person. That was the mistake he couldn't undo. You can correct a misunderstanding in real time. You cannot correct a pattern after it's been logged. He asked me directly, finally, if something was wrong between us. I told him the truth, carefully, that I felt clear. That answer unsettled him more than anger would have, because clarity doesn't invite negotiation. He began to realize that the version of me he had relied on, the one who explained, who softened, who absorbed tension, was no longer doing that work. Not out of spite, not out of withdrawal, out of completion. Regret entered quietly. Not Not remorse in the moral sense, but the logistical kind. The realization that certain doors had closed without fanfare, that certain assumptions were no longer available, that reassurance, once sufficient, now required substantiation. He tried to return to earlier dynamics, to speak for me again, to contextualize my reactions, but the timing was wrong. The environment had shifted. The same words landed differently when spoken too late. People listened, but they no longer concluded. And that's when confusion hardened into fear. Fear of being misunderstood, fear of losing credibility, fear of having to answer questions he had never prepared for because he never expected to be asked them. I watched all of this without satisfaction, because what I felt wasn't triumph. It was finality. This was the point of no return, not because I had done something drastic, but because the system now required accuracy. And accuracy doesn't negotiate with comfort. Too late to explain, too late to reframe, too late to rely on implication. What had been quietly set in motion the months earlier was now operating independently of either of us. And I knew with a calm certainty that nothing emotional could fix it, because the problem was no longer interpersonal. It was structural. The confrontation didn't look like one. There was no raised voice, no sharp accusation, no emotional crescendo. If someone had been listening from another room, they might not have recognized it as a turning point at all. It happened on an ordinary evening, in a quiet space, with neutral lighting and no witnesses. That felt appropriate. He asked if we could talk. Not urgently, not defensively, just with a careful tone that suggested he already sensed the ground wasn't where he left it. We sat across from each other. He spoke first. He said he felt something had changed, that he couldn't quite place it, but that things felt off. He mentioned confusion, distance, a sense that decisions were being made without him understanding how or why. I listened without interrupting. When he finished, there was a pause. Not the uncomfortable kind, the kind that allows a thought to settle before it's spoken. I told him I agreed that things had changed. That was all. He waited for more. An explanation, an emotion, a justification. I could see him preparing to respond to something louder, more charged. But I didn't give him that. I told him, calmly, that I had spent a long time observing how decisions were made in our relationship, and how my perspective was often summarized rather than included. I said I had noticed how concern had replaced consultation, how my silence had been interpreted as consent. I didn't accuse him of malice. I didn't assign intent. I spoke only about structure. He tried to interrupt once. I let him. He offered context, clarification. He said he had only been trying to help, that he thought I preferred it that way. I nodded. Then I said something that ended the conversation, even though it didn't sound final. I said, I understand why you thought that, but it's not accurate. Accuracy again. I explained that I had taken steps to ensure my voice existed independently of interpretation, that this wasn't about punishing him or correcting the past, that it was about alignment going forward. He asked if we could fix it. I told him I wasn't interested in fixing dynamics that relied on mischaracterization, that I wasn't angry, but I was finished negotiating my capacity. There was a long silence after that. Not explosive, just empty. He looked at me like someone recalculating a map after realizing north isn't where they assumed. I could see him searching for leverage, for emotion, for reassurance, for something familiar to respond to. There was nothing there. When the conversation ended, it ended cleanly. No promises, no ultimatums, no dramatic exit. Just an understanding, unevenly distributed, that the version of me he had been interacting with no longer existed. And that this wasn't a phase. I'm still quiet. That surprises people who expect transformation to announce itself with volume. They imagine confidence as something sharp, something declarative. But the truth is, I didn't become louder. I became clearer. Clarity doesn't need amplification. The version of me that exists now isn't hardened. She isn't suspicious. She isn't constantly guarding herself against misinterpretation. What changed wasn't my temperament. It was my positioning. I no longer offer access without context. I no longer allow my internal process to be summarized by someone else's convenience. When I speak now, I do it with precision. When I'm silent, it's because there's nothing left to clarify, not because I've been crowded out. There's no bitterness in this phase. That part matters to me. Bitterness would mean I'm still orienting myself around what happened. I'm not. What I carry instead is discernment. I understand now how easily competence can be mistaken for compliance, how calm can be rewritten as fragility, how restraint, without boundaries, invites narration. And I understand my own role in that story. Not with shame, but with responsibility. I stayed quiet too long because I believed dignity was passive. I believed being reasonable would be recognized as strength. I didn't yet understand that systems don't read intention, they read behavior, repetition, and record. That knowledge didn't make me cynical. It made me exact. In my life now, roles are discussed, not assumed. Decisions are documented, not implied. Care is mutual, not managerial. If someone feels the need to explain me, I correct them. Not emotionally, not defensively, but clearly. No, that's not accurate. That sentence has become one of the most powerful tools I own. I don't say it often. I don't need to. People who value clarity respond to it immediately. People who rely on ambiguity feel exposed by it. Either way, the outcome is information. I don't regret my marriage. I don't even regret how long it took me to see the pattern. Every system reveals itself on its own timeline. Mine did, and I listened when it mattered. What I regret is the version of myself that believed silence alone would protect her. Silence can be dignified. Silence can be strategic. But silence without structure is just absence. Now, my quiet has edges. Not sharp ones, but defined ones. It doesn't invite interpretation. It doesn't need to. I'm still Luna, still observant, still calm, just no longer available for erasure. There's a temptation, at the end of stories like this, to offer a warning, to say watch out, or don't let this happen to you. But life isn't that simple, and I don't believe in fear as a teacher. What I believe in is awareness. Nothing that happened to me began with cruelty. That's the part people find hardest to accept. It began with convenience, with assumptions, with language that sounded caring and reasonable on the surface. It grew because it worked, because it simplified things for someone else while slowly narrowing the space I was allowed to occupy. That's how these dynamics survive, not through villains, but through narratives that go unexamined. The most important lesson I took from this wasn't about marriage or even about law. It was about authorship, about who gets to define capacity, stability, and credibility, and how easily those definitions harden when left unchallenged. I learned that being calm doesn't protect you if others are speaking for you, that being reasonable doesn't help if the system only recognizes confidence, and that silence, when misunderstood, can be repurposed into evidence against you. But I also learned something quieter and more hopeful. I learned that you don't have to become aggressive to reclaim yourself. You don't have to perform anger or demand validation. You don't have to prove you're strong in the way the world expects. You can be precise. Precision is not loud. Precision is not dramatic. Precision is simply refusing to allow inaccuracy to stand uncorrected, especially when it carries consequences. I didn't win anything in the conventional sense. There was no public reckoning, no applause, no moment where everyone suddenly realized who I was all along. What I gained was something smaller and far more durable. I gained alignment between who I am and how I'm recorded. And once you have that, you don't need revenge. You don't need vindication. You don't even need agreement. You need very little. If you're listening to this and recognizing pieces of yourself, if you've ever felt reduced, translated, or managed under the guise of concern, know this. You are not imagining it, and you are not required to correct it emotionally. You're allowed to step back, to observe, to document, to choose clarity over immediacy. And you're allowed to do it quietly. I'll leave you with one question, not to provoke, but to invite reflection. Has there ever been a moment in your life when someone else's version of you started carrying more weight than your own? And what would change if you reclaimed authorship now? If you feel comfortable, I'd like to hear your thoughts in the comments.
Cảm ơn bạn đã theo dõi. Hãy bấm đăng ký và bật chuông để luôn cập nhật nội dung mới. Hẹn